The 12th of May, 1941. Morning light over Coventry, England. A widow named Margaret Fletcher stood in what used to be her living room, her hands covered in brick dust, her mind unable to process the destruction surrounding her. The Luftwaffe had taken everything. Her home, her neighbourhood, her sense of safety. She had been told to evacuate, to move to the countryside like everyone else. But when a government official knocked on her door 3 weeks later with an unexpected proposal, something strange happened. No evacuation order, no sympathy, just a man in a suit explaining that German prisoners of war would be rebuilding damaged houses and asking if she'd accept their labour. Margaret didn't understand. None of her neighbours did. These were the enemy, the men who had dropped the bombs. Why would she let them anywhere near what remained of her home? That moment would change everything she believed about hate, about forgiveness, and about what happens when enemies are forced to rebuild what they destroyed. Because in the ruins of Coventry, Britain was fighting a different kind of war. Not with guns, but with something far more complicated. The recognition that reconstruction required hands, even enemy hands. And what happened next would force Margaret to choose between the anger burning in her chest and the practical reality that her roof wouldn't fix itself. Stay till the end to see how one widow's fear became one of the most controversial stories of the home front, and how German prisoners taught an English town that sometimes healing begins with the people who caused the wound. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video to support our channel and help us tell more forgotten stories of history that deserve to be remembered. It was the 3rd week of November somewhere over the Midlands. The sky was black and full of searchlights. The sound of air raid sirens filled the night air. Margaret Fletcher, a 34-year-old schoolteacher from Coventry, had been widowed for 8 months. The Spitfire that killed her husband Robert had crashed during a training exercise, not in combat, which somehow made it worse. When the sirens wailed that night, she grabbed her daughter Emma, age 7, and ran for the Anderson shelter in the back garden. The smell of damp earth and fear filled the small metal structure. The bombers came in waves. Heinkel He-111s and Dornier Do-17s, dropping high explosive bombs and incendiaries. The ground shook with each impact. The shelter rattled. Emma screamed and covered her ears. Margaret held her tight, whispering prayers and lies about everything being fine. When the all-clear sounded 14 hours later, Margaret emerged into a different world. Her street was gone, not damaged. Gone. Houses reduced to rubble and smoking craters. The smell of burning wood and gas filled the air. Her home, a modest 2-story terraced house that had belonged to Robert's family for 3 generations, was half collapsed. The front wall had caved in, the roof was mostly missing. Everything inside was buried under brick and plaster. She had grown up hearing that Germans were civilized, that they followed rules, that war had limits. But standing in her ruined street, watching neighbours dig through rubble for bodies, she understood the truth. War had no limits. And the enemy was not civilized. They were monsters who bombed civilians at night. So when she saw the German bomber shot down 2 streets away, its crew captured by Home Guard, her first thought was simple. Good. Let them burn like we burned. The irony came fast. The prisoners who were marched past her house the next morning didn't look like monsters. They moved like exhausted boys, hands raised, faces smudged with soot. One of them, no older than 20, made eye contact with her as he passed. He looked terrified. Margaret felt nothing. No sympathy, no connection, just the cold satisfaction that at least these particular Germans would face justice. They loaded the captured airmen onto trucks. The smell of cordite and smoke still hung in the air. Margaret stared at her ruined house, at Emma crying beside her, and realised that surviving the bombs was only the beginning. Now came the impossible task of rebuilding a life from rubble. For the first few weeks, anger was stronger than grief. She and Emma moved into a church hall converted into emergency housing. 200 people crammed into a space meant for 100. Thin mattresses on the floor, shared bathrooms, the constant noise of crying children and arguing adults. The government promised reconstruction assistance, but with thousands of homes destroyed and the war ongoing, the waiting list stretched into years. She heard other displaced families whisper, "We'll never get our homes back." One woman said, "They've destroyed Britain. We'll be living in ruins forever." That winter, volunteers came to clear the rubble, mostly older men and women, doing what they could with shovels and wheelbarrows. Margaret joined them, digging through the remains of her house, salvaging what little remained intact. A photograph of her wedding, Emma's favourite doll, somehow unbroken, a tea set that had belonged to Robert's mother. She packed these treasures in a cardboard box and wondered if she'd ever have a home to put them in again. At night, she couldn't sleep. The church hall was cold, and Emma had nightmares about bombs. Margaret would hold her daughter in the darkness, listening to the other families breathing and snoring around them, and think about the German pilot who had dropped the bomb that destroyed their house. She imagined him safe in Germany, celebrating with his crew, never thinking about the woman and child whose lives he'd ruined. The hatred kept her warm when blankets couldn't. By March 1941, something changed. The government announced a new labour programme. German prisoners of war, captured from bomber crews and U-boat crews, would be put to work rebuilding damaged British cities. "We need every available hand," the announcement said, "even enemy hands." The reaction was immediate and furious. People protested. "They destroyed our homes, and now we're supposed to let them rebuild them. They should be in prison camps, not walking our streets." But the government was firm. Britain's construction workforce was decimated. Men were in the military. Materials were scarce. The choice was simple: accept German labour or live in ruins indefinitely. When the official came to the church hall in May, he carried a clipboard and an apologetic expression. He explained the programme to the displaced families. German POWs would work under British supervision. They'd be housed in secure camps. They'd receive basic wages paid to the British government. All work would follow Geneva Convention standards. "You have the right to refuse," he said. "But if you accept, your home moves to the top of the reconstruction list." Margaret stood with the other families, listening to angry voices argue and debate. One man shouted, "I'd rather live in rubble than accept help from the bastards who bombed me." Others nodded, but then a woman in the back, older and tired-looking, said quietly, "I have grandchildren. They need a home. I don't care whose hands build it." The room went silent. The official looked at Margaret. "Mrs. Fletcher, your house is on the list. What's your decision?" Margaret thought about Emma sleeping on a thin mattress, about the tea set packed in a cardboard box, about the hatred that kept her awake, and about the simple fact that pride doesn't provide shelter. "Yes," she said quietly, "I accept." The murmurs started immediately, some supportive, others condemning, but Margaret didn't care. She'd made her choice. The prisoners arrived 2 weeks later. Margaret stood at what used to be her front gate, watching as a military truck pulled up and 6 German POWs climbed out, flanked by 2 British guards. The prisoners wore uniforms dyed brown to distinguish them from combat soldiers. They carried tool bags and lunch pails. They looked nervous. The guard in charge, a sergeant named Davies, approached Margaret with a formal nod. "Mrs. Fletcher, these men will be working on your property for the next 6 weeks. They're under strict supervision. Any problems, you report to me immediately." Margaret nodded, unable to speak. Her throat felt tight. One of the prisoners, a man in his 30s with careful eyes, stepped forward. He spoke in accented English. "Good morning, Frau Fletcher. My name is Hans Müller. I was a builder in Hamburg before the war. I will do good work for you." Margaret stared at him. This man might have been on the raid that destroyed her house, might have been in one of those bombers, and now he was standing in her garden, promising good work. She wanted to scream. Instead, she said, "Just fix the roof first. My daughter needs shelter." "Ja," Hans said. "The roof first. I understand." They started immediately. The sound of hammering and sawing filled the street. Neighbours came out to watch, some curious, others hostile. One man spat at the prisoners. Sergeant Davies intervened, threatening arrest. The work was slow but steady. The Germans cleared rubble, salvaged bricks, rebuilt the collapsed front wall. They worked in silence mostly, aware of the hostile eyes watching from every direction. Margaret watched from across the street, unable to be closer, unable to look away. In the evening, she saw Hans examining a damaged brick, checking if it could be reused. He handled it carefully, almost reverently, like he cared about the work, not just completing a task. That simple gesture confused her. She'd expected the prisoners to be careless, resentful, doing the minimum required. But they worked with precision and care. By the end of the first week, the front wall was rebuilt. The roof framework was in place. Progress was visible. Emma asked, "Mummy, are those the bad men fixing our house?" Margaret didn't know how to answer. "They're prisoners," she finally said. "They have to work." "But they're fixing it nicely," Emma observed. Yes, Margaret thought, they were. On the 8th day, something happened that changed everything. Margaret was bringing tea to Sergeant Davies when she heard shouting. One of the younger Germans, a boy no older than 19, had stepped on a loose board and fallen through the damaged floor into the cellar. His scream echoed through the ruins. The other prisoners rushed to help. Hans climbed down carefully, calling instructions in German. Margaret stood frozen, unsure what to do. When they pulled the boy out, his leg was bleeding badly. A nail had torn through his calf. The wound was deep. Sergeant Davies swore. "We need to get him to Camp Medical." "That's 30 minutes, Hans said urgently. "He needs treatment now." Everyone looked at Margaret. Her house had first aid supplies. She'd been a volunteer nurse during the last war. She had bandages, antiseptic, needle and thread for sutures. The boy was crying in pain, blood soaking through his trousers. German or not, prisoner or not, he was bleeding in her garden. Margaret heard Robert's voice in her head, from before the war, before everything. "We're doctors and nurses first, Margaret. Politics comes second." She ran inside the church hall and grabbed her medical kit. When she returned, the Germans had laid the boy on a cleared section of ground. Hans was applying pressure to the wound. Margaret knelt beside them. "Move your hand," she said. Hans hesitated, then obeyed. The wound was ragged but not life-threatening. Margaret cleaned it with antiseptic. The boy gasped, gripping Hans's arm. "This will hurt," Margaret said. She irrigated the wound, removed debris, and stitched it closed with quick, practiced movements. The Germans watched in silence. When she finished, she bandaged the leg tightly. "Keep it elevated. Change the dressing daily. No weight on it for a week." Hans translated to German. The boy nodded, tears streaming down his face. "Danke," he whispered. "Thank you." Margaret stood, hands bloody, staring at her work. She'd just helped the enemy, saved a German who might have killed British people. The realization made her dizzy. Sergeant Davies cleared his throat. "That was well done, Mrs. Fletcher. Probably saved his leg." Margaret said nothing. She walked back to the church hall, washed her hands, and sat on her mattress shaking. That night, Emma asked, "Did you help the German boy?" "Yes." "That was kind, Mummy." Was it? Margaret wasn't sure. Kindness implied choice. This had felt like reflex, like her hands had acted before her mind could object. The next morning, Hans approached her with a small wooden box. He'd carved it from salvaged timber, smoothed and polished. Inside was a note in careful English. "Thank you for helping Karl. You did not have to. You are a good person. HM." Margaret stared at the box for a long time. She wanted to throw it away, wanted to reject this gesture of gratitude from the enemy. But the craftsmanship was beautiful. Emma would love it for her treasures. She kept it. The work continued. The roof was completed. Windows were installed. Plaster repaired. The house slowly emerged from ruins. Other families on the street, seeing the progress, reluctantly accepted German labour for their own homes. By July, 12 houses were being rebuilt by POW work crews. The neighbourhood transformed from rubble to something resembling normal. But tensions remained high. Some neighbours wouldn't speak to Margaret, called her a collaborator, said she'd betrayed Britain by accepting enemy help. One woman spat at her in the market. "My son died at Dunkirk, and you're having tea with Germans." "I'm not having tea with them," Margaret said coldly. "They're rebuilding my house." "Same thing," the woman said. But it wasn't the same thing. Margaret maintained strict distance from the prisoners. She didn't speak to them except for necessary instructions. Didn't offer them food or water beyond what regulations required. Didn't acknowledge their presence beyond what work demanded. Yet she couldn't help noticing things. Hans never wasted materials. He'd sort through rubble for an hour to find one reusable brick rather than request new supplies. The young one, Karl, returned to work after his leg healed, walking with a limp but determined to finish what he'd started. Another prisoner, Ernst, sang quietly while working. German folk songs that reminded Margaret of music Robert had played on their gramophone before the war. One afternoon, Emma approached the work site while Margaret wasn't watching. Hans was mixing mortar when Emma said, "My daddy died in an airplane." Hans stopped. He looked at the little girl with sad eyes. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "My daughter is also without her father. I have not seen her in 2 years." Emma tilted her head. "Is she sad?" "I think yes. Very sad." "I'm sad too," Emma said. Then she ran back to Margaret. When Margaret asked what she'd been talking about, Emma said, "The German man misses his daughter, like I miss Daddy." Margaret felt something crack in her chest. These men had lives, families, daughters. They weren't just the enemy. They were fathers, husbands, sons. The bombs they dropped had been orders, not choices. Just like Robert's death had been duty, not desire. The realization didn't erase her anger, but it complicated it. By August, Margaret's house was nearly complete. The final touches were being added: fresh paint, repaired plumbing, a new front door. It looked better than before the bombing. Hans approached her on the last day of work. "Mrs. Fletcher, we finish tomorrow. I want to say I am sorry. For the bombs, for your husband, for everything." Margaret stared at him. "You didn't drop the bomb on my house." "No," Hans said. "But my countrymen did. We all carry that." "Just like I carry the bombs we dropped on Hamburg?" Margaret asked. Hans met her eyes. "Yes, exactly like that." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Hans said, "War makes us all into things we are not. After, we must try to become human again." The next day, the prisoners loaded their tools. The work was complete. Sergeant Davies inspected the house and signed off. Margaret and Emma would move back in the following week. As the truck prepared to leave, Karl approached Emma. He handed her a small wooden horse he'd carved. "For you," he said shyly. Emma took it, delighted. "Thank you!" Karl smiled, then climbed into the truck. As they drove away, Margaret watched them go. 6 German prisoners who had rebuilt her home, who had worked with care and skill, who had been enemy and labour and, briefly, something more complicated than either word could contain. A neighbour walked up beside her. "Well, at least they did good work." "Yes," Margaret said, "they did." That night, in her own home for the first time in 9 months, Margaret sat Emma down for dinner. They ate at the kitchen table Hans had repaired. Emma played with the wooden horse Karl had carved. And Margaret thought about Hans's words. We must try to become human again. Maybe that was what peace meant, not forgetting what happened, but choosing to be human despite it. The war continued for 4 more years. More bombs fell. More people died. But Margaret's house stood firm. The roof never leaked. The walls never cracked. The Germans had built it to last. In 1945, when the war finally ended, The POW camps were emptied. Thousands of German prisoners were repatriated. Margaret wondered about Hans, about Karl and Ernst, whether they'd made it home, whether they'd found their families, whether Hamburg still existed, or if it had been bombed as thoroughly as Coventry. She'd never know. But she thought about them. Years later, in 1952, Margaret received a letter. German postage. Careful handwriting. Dear Mrs. Fletcher, this is Hans Müller. I do not know if you remember me. I worked on your house in Coventry during the war. I returned to Hamburg and found my family alive, though our home was destroyed, as yours was. I have rebuilt it, just as I rebuilt yours. I wanted to write to say thank you. You treated me with dignity when you did not have to. You saved Karl's leg. You showed me that humanity survives even in war. I am a builder again now. Every house I build, I think of yours. I try to do work that lasts, work that shelters families, work that means something. I hope you and your daughter are well. I hope the house still stands. With respect and gratitude, Hans Müller. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, the same one Hans had repaired, and cried. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming weight of connection across years and borders. She wrote back, a simple letter. Dear Hans, I remember you. The house still stands. Your work was excellent. I'm glad you found your family. I'm glad you're building again. The war took so much from all of us, but your work gave me back my home, and that meant everything. Thank you, Margaret Fletcher. They corresponded for years after that, never frequently, just occasional letters, updates on families, on work, on the slow process of rebuilding lives from the ruins of war. In 1958, Hans sent photographs of his daughter's wedding. Margaret sent photographs of Emma's university graduation. Two families, connected by bombs and reconstruction, by destruction and repair. By the 1960s, Britain had moved on. The war became history, commemorated but distant. But Margaret never forgot the 6 weeks when German prisoners rebuilt her house. She told the story to anyone who'd listen. Not everyone wanted to hear it. Some people still carried too much anger, still saw Germans as only enemy, never human. But others understood. They'd had similar experiences. POWs working on farms, in factories, in hospitals. Men who'd been enemy becoming, however briefly, something more complicated. Margaret became involved in reconciliation efforts, British-German friendship societies, programs bringing young people together. She believed deeply that the hatred had to end somewhere, that cycles of revenge only created more ruins. In 1973, Hans visited England. He was old now, grey and slow-moving, but his hands were still steady. Carpenter's hands, builder's hands. Margaret invited him to lunch at her house, the house he'd rebuilt. They sat in the living room, drinking tea, talking about children and grandchildren and the absurd distance between 1941 and 1973. Do you know what I remember most? Hans said. The day you treated Karl's leg. You could have let him bleed, said it was a military matter, but you didn't. I couldn't, Margaret said. He was hurt. Exactly, Hans said. That is what humanity means, not ignoring who someone is, but seeing that before what they are. He looked around the room, at the walls he'd built, the ceiling he'd repaired. This house is my best work, he said quietly. Not because of the craftsmanship, but because of what it meant. You let us fix what we'd broken. That was grace. Margaret thought about that word. Grace. I didn't do it to be gracious, she admitted. I did it because I needed a roof. Hans laughed. And that makes it even better. Grace doesn't have to be noble, it just has to be possible. When he left that evening, they embraced at the door. Two old people who'd been enemies once, who'd been strangers thrown together by war's brutality and peace's practicality. Who'd learned that sometimes the people who break you are the ones who help you heal, not because it erases what happened, but because healing has to start somewhere. Margaret lived in that house until she died in 1987 at the age of 80. Emma inherited it, raised her own children there. The structure Hans and his crew built held strong for decades. When Emma finally sold it in 2005, the new owners discovered something during renovations. Behind a wall panel in the living room was a small carving, names and dates in German. H. Müller, K. Schmidt, E. Weber, Mai 1941, Wiederaufbau. Rebuild. Hans and his crew had signed their work. Hidden it, where no one would find it for decades, a secret testament to their labour. Emma contacted a historian who tracked down records. Hans had died in 1979. Karl in 1994. Ernst was still alive, living in a nursing home in Munich at age 89. Emma wrote to him, sent photographs of the carving, explained that her mother had always spoken warmly of the German prisoners who rebuilt their house. Ernst wrote back. His English was shaky, but his meaning clear. We were prisoners, but we were also builders. Your mother treated us like humans. In war, that was rare. That was precious. Tell everyone that enemies can become builders, that hate can become respect, that houses can be rebuilt, and so can hearts. Emma framed his letter and hung it in her own home, along with photographs of Margaret and Hans from 1973. Proof that reconciliation was possible, not easy, not complete, but possible. The story spread. Articles were written about the house in Coventry, the German POWs, the widow who'd let them rebuild. Some celebrated it as an example of humanity in wartime. Others criticised it as collaboration, as weakness, as betrayal of British values. But Margaret had known the truth long before academics debated it. Sometimes healing isn't about forgetting. It's about choosing to move forward despite memory. It's about recognising that the person who hurt you might also be the person who helps you rebuild. It's about accepting that war creates categories: enemy, ally, victim, perpetrator. But peace requires something more complicated. It requires seeing individuals within those categories, recognising their humanity without excusing their actions, taking their help without forgetting what they did. In 2015, a memorial was unveiled in Coventry, not just to the Blitz victims, though they were honoured, but to the complicated history of reconstruction, to the German POWs who'd helped rebuild British cities, to the British citizens who'd made the difficult choice to accept enemy labour, to the understanding that survival sometimes requires cooperation with people you have every right to hate. Emma attended the ceremony. She was 81 now, the same age Margaret had been at death. She stood before the memorial and thought about her mother, about the fear that had turned to pragmatism, about the pragmatism that had turned slowly into something like understanding. She thought about Hans and Karl and Ernst, about men who'd been ordered to bomb cities, then ordered to rebuild them, about how they'd done both with the same diligence. She thought about the wooden box and the carved horse, about small gestures of humanity in the midst of horror. And she understood what her mother had tried to teach her, that the opposite of hatred isn't love, it's recognition. The recognition that your enemy is human, that their humanity doesn't erase their actions, that their actions don't erase their humanity, and that moving forward requires holding both truths simultaneously. The memorial's inscription read, "In memory of those who died in the Coventry Blitz, November 1940, and in recognition of those who rebuilt what was destroyed, including the 2,000 German prisoners of war who worked in British cities 1941 to 1945. May we remember the destruction and honour the reconstruction." Emma touched the stone, thinking of her mother's house, still standing after 74 years, built by enemy hands, sheltering generations. Proof that sometimes the greatest act of defiance isn't refusing help from those who hurt you. It's accepting their help, letting them rebuild what they destroyed, and choosing to see their effort as the beginning of something new. Not forgiveness, not forgetting, but the recognition that survival requires strange alliances, that peace is built by imperfect people making difficult choices, and that sometimes, just sometimes, the enemy's hands can build something that lasts.